When I ask women lawyers how competent they are on a scale from 1 to 10, they almost always say 9 out of 10. But when I ask them how confident they are, they almost always say 5 out of 10. Which is why too many law firms end up with the most confident people as partners, but not necessarily the most competent. My name is Cecilia Poullain. Welcome to the Pathway to Partnership podcast, where women lawyers come to figure out what success really looks like for them. My name is Cecilia Poullain. I used to be a finance lawyer, and now I coach women lawyers who want to make partner without losing themselves in the process. Each week, we explore the 3 pillars of my Pathway to Partnership program: clarity, confidence, and client development, so you can grow your career with focus, courage, and authenticity. Okay, let's jump in. If you're a woman lawyer, I'm guessing you've been in meetings in which you've been interrupted, talked over, or ignored. Actually, I'm not guessing, I know. Because in 2020, I did a survey of women lawyers in France, the UK, and the US, and all the women spontaneously told me the same thing. They told me that they were so sick of being interrupted in meetings. And not only interrupted, they were sick of having their ideas stolen or being ignored. The very first Firm Women Breakfast that I held in Paris in July 2024 was on exactly this topic. And there was such an overwhelming reaction. Everybody had so many examples that we didn't even have time to get to solutions. So I organised a second breakfast on the same theme. Here's a couple of examples. I had a client who was a partner in an international law firm, and her ideas were constantly being ignored by the partners in her office. And once, and it's not a big example, but it's just an example of what was happening to her. Once they were looking for a new courier company, and quite sensibly she suggested that they use one of the big international firms. Her suggestion was completely ignored, and they decided to use a local courier company, only to change back 6 months later to exactly the same international courier company she had suggested. As you can imagine, she was furious. Here's another example that comes from a professor of law. She was in a meeting when a colleague referred to his paper. He said, in my paper. And she said, I think that would be our paper actually. And in fact, it was entirely her work. And even though the other people around the table knew that, she was severely criticised in the meeting for making that remark, and nobody stood up for her. Then after the meeting, some of the people who had been in the meeting and had witnessed what had happened came up to her and said, "Oh, his behaviour was so appalling." But they hadn't stood up for her in the meeting. Women aren't just interrupted by men, they're interrupted by men and women. And there is a ton of research that shows that women's voices generally are less recognised in our society. And I now notice myself not taking women as seriously as men. In their book, Women in Leadership, Julia Gillard, who was the Australian Prime Minister, and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria, quote Michelle Bachelet, who I'm sure you remember was the president of Chile. So Michelle said this: "A male colleague, who was also an advisor to the minister, said to me, 'I know that you gave the idea, and I just repeated it in another way.' So in fact, some men are consciously using the fact that they're listened to more than the women and feel quite happy just stealing their ideas. But I can tell you, this drives women crazy. Women are in a double bind. Either they can raise their voices so that they're heard, but then they're criticised as being hysterical or acting like a man or inauthentic. Or on the other hand, they're ignored and have their ideas stolen. Obviously, it doesn't happen in every law firm. It doesn't happen in every department. There are lots of people out there who are very respectful of everybody's point of view, but it's still happening way too much. What's the impact? Well, first of all, it is incredibly frustrating for the women, especially if they don't know how to deal with it. But it goes much further than that, because it means that women lawyers aren't being seen as partnership material. Because if you're not speaking up enough in meetings, then meetings are often the places where people are judged and where they say, she might be partnership potential. So if you're being cut off all the time, it means that actually you're having less opportunity to express yourself. It means that more confident people, often men, are promoted over women who can often be more anxious, less confident, and more competent. When I ask women on a scale from 1 to 10 how competent they are, they almost always say 9 out of 10. When I ask them how confident they are, they almost always say 5 out of 10. So it means that law firms end up with the most confident people, but not necessarily the most competent people as partners. You obviously need a certain level of confidence, but there is a level that is enough, and there is certainly a level that is too much. So, for example, I've been hearing stories about male solicitors who go to a firm, negotiate a massive salary, and then after a while people realise that actually they are definitely not worth that salary and not worth anything like it. And so they leave and go to another firm, and at the next firm they say, well, at the last firm I was on this massive salary, so I must be worth it. And so they go from firm to firm. That's what happens when you recruit people who are overconfident. The impact of women being interrupted also means that women shut themselves down. So they worry about speaking in case they're criticised or interrupted. There was a participant in a workshop I did many years ago, and she said, the boss was so rude to me in that meeting that I decided that I would never, ever speak in that meeting again. What a terrible waste of her talent and her ideas, and of the talent and ideas of so many women lawyers and of women generally. So what can we do about it? The first thing you can do about it is actually get very clear on what you want. And how do you know? It's by listening to yourself, listening to your emotions, instead of listening to what other people are telling you to do. And then you work out how you're going to get it. And when you have that clarity, that gives you an enormous amount of power, it gives you an enormous amount of charisma, and people will listen to you. You can use meta-communication. So meta-communication means communicating about how we're communicating, and saying things like, you probably don't realise it, but that's the 3rd time you've interrupted me in this meeting. Or perhaps, I've noticed that some of us aren't saying much in these meetings and others are doing all the talking. I'm actually getting pretty frustrated about that. Or it's saying things like, when somebody does interrupt you, just saying, actually, I'm not finished yet. Let me finish. But you can also ask other people to support you in a meeting. So if it's a meeting in which you know that you're systematically interrupted, you can say to other people, could you actually jump in? And they might say something like, I don't think Chris finished what she was saying a moment ago. I'd like to hear more. And you can also be looking out and helping others when they're being interrupted. You can use amplification. So this is a concept which was used by Obama's cabinet. And the idea is that you amplify women's ideas by saying, first of all, that a woman said it, and then you repeat what she said. And so it means that it's much more difficult for somebody then to steal her idea. And it also means that she's actually listened to. And you can also say something like, if someone is taking your idea, say something like, well, I'm so glad you agree with that idea that I just expressed. And finally, what we can do as women is talk about our experiences, because men often have no idea. I ran a whole series of workshops recently, and in one of the workshops we mentioned this problem. And to his credit, between the two sessions, one of the men had gone and asked the women around him whether this was a problem for them, whether they were being constantly interrupted. And he was amazed to find that they all said it was a problem. So the more we actually talk about it, the more people will realise. And often when they realise, they stop doing it. And then each time it happens, instead of getting annoyed or getting down about it, use it as practice. Notice what's happening. Try something out. See if it works. See if it doesn't. It's all just practice. And encouragingly, some women have told me that actually when they get senior enough, the problem just disappears. They are even more respected because people know how hard it is for women to reach those positions. This is what we've covered in this episode. First of all, we've looked at the fact that it's a major problem. Women are systematically being silenced, which is incredibly frustrating for them. It means they're shutting themselves down, and it means they aren't reaching their full potential. The impact on many of the law firms is that it's the most confident people, not the most competent people, who are being asked to join the partnership. We've looked at a number of tools to deal with it, including getting clear on what you want, asking for help for others, asking for what you want, and meta-communication. So maybe you'd like to think about if you have a meeting coming up, and if you do, and most of us do, you might want to take a moment to think about how you want to turn up in that meeting, what energy you want to bring, how you want to be perceived, and perhaps what technique you would like to practice. And if this is a frequent problem for you, please reach out to me. That's it for this episode. So thank you so much for joining me on the Pathway to Partnership podcast. I really appreciate it. And I hope that today's episode has given you a realization that you are not the only one being interrupted or ignored, and a few useful techniques to deal with it when it happens. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe. Please share it with a colleague. Please leave a review. Let's together help more women make it to partnership and thrive when they get there. If you'd like to go deeper, head over to my website at ceciliapoullain.com. You'll find resources and ways that we can work together. And until next time, remember, you don't have to do this alone. And you get to define success as a woman lawyer on your own terms. Thanks for listening.